Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Northampton mystery tour, which is going to focus on Thomas Becket and medieval Northampton. Thank you very much for coming and joining me today. And before I begin, I'd like to begin by thanking a couple of people who have made this possible. Firstly, I would like to thank James Smith and LGTheatre for including this talk in Northampton mystery tours and for their help by setting this up online. I'd also like to thank Dr. Mary Dickey and the Friends of Northampton Castle for getting this talk in motion. There will be time for questions at the end of this talk, so if you have a question or if there is something I say that you'd like to ask about, please use the chat function on the side of your screens and I will answer to the best of my abilities at the end of my talk. On the 29th of December, 1170, 850 years ago, 4 knights entered Canterbury Cathedral to kill the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, supposedly on the orders of King Henry II of England. This momentous act of extreme violence was not a random act of violence and brutality, but the culmination of years of a prolonged dispute between Henry II and his Archbishop. This dispute, commonly known as the Becket controversy, was multifaceted and complex, and it is impossible to pinpoint one single cause. For example, Becket's martyrdom was prompted in the immediacy by his suspension of the Archbishop of York and other bishops for their role in the coronation of Henry II's son, Henry the Young King, as Henry II's co-king in June 1170. They did this against papal prohibition and against the express wishes of Thomas Becket whilst he was in exile in France. This act threw Henry II into an infamous fit of rage when he is reported to have said, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and prompted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such contempt by a low-born clerk." This is famously, but incorrectly, rendered as "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" The Becket controversy and the main issues at stake can generally be summarised in 2 ways. It was firstly about the freedom of the Church and the wider context of ecclesiastical liberty in the 12th century under papal guidance. And secondly, it was about the immunities that the English Church enjoyed within the kingdom. My talk is going to focus on Becket's trial at the Council of Northampton in 1164 and the events that led up to this, a significant event that marked the final break in the relationship of Henry II and Thomas Becket. It is, apart from his murder, also the most attested episode of Becket's life. Before moving on to the narrative of Becket's early life and career, I'm going to set the scene with a description of medieval Northampton. Despite archaeological evidence of a settlement at Northampton from early Roman times, there was no settlement of significance before the Danish conquest of England, or parts of England, in the 9th century. It is with the Norman conquest in 1066 that Northampton became a town of national importance. It features within Domesday Book, from 1086, a survey of land tenure by William the Conqueror. Crucially, there is no mention of a castle or an earl in the Domesday Book, and it is believed that the castle was constructed after 1086 and before 1130, during the reign of the first Norman Earl Simon de Senchales. In 1130, the castle became a royal residence. Essentially, Northampton's importance as a town after 1066 is down to its convenience as a meeting place. Its central geographical location made it convenient for councils to gather and meet, and this is attested by the number of royal councils in the 12th and early 13th centuries, and is later seen with parliaments in the 14th century. The list I'm about to give is not an exclusive one, but there are some of the more important and most famous ones. For example, the Council of 1131, Henry I required his barons to swear fealty to his daughter, the Empress Matilda, to accept her as the heir to the throne. This was a repetition and renewal for some of the barons who had previously sworn in 1126. On the 17th of July, 1157, Henry II and Becket, who was at the time Royal Chancellor, announced a military campaign against the Welsh. It is believed, In 1176, the Assize of Northampton were agreed at Northampton, and they were measures that solidified the rights of knightly tenants under royal law. And in 1211, King John met papal nuncios, or papal ambassadors, at Northampton, where he was threatened with excommunication by Pope Innocent III. In the 14th century, just for a bit of context, parliaments that met here also were significant. For example, in 1328, peace was agreed with Scotland, and in 1380, it was decided to impose the poll tax that led to the infamous Peasants' Revolt in 1381. In addition to being a convenient meeting place, Northampton's geographical position made it a strategic military base as well, as forces could control the north to south and the east to west very easily. In 1173, the town held for Henry II during the revolt of his sons, including his son, the young king, his co-king. In 1215, the first move of the insurgent barons against King John was to besiege Northampton. Northampton's popularity with royalty is also probably explained by several hunting lodges and other residences in the rest of the county. For example, there were lodges at Silverstone and King's Cliff, and there was also a royal palace at Geddington. It is unsurprising that an event as significant as the trial of the then current Archbishop of Canterbury and former Royal Chancellor happened in Northampton. As I said before, the castle was a royal residence, and it was conveniently located for a gathering of the royal court. I now move to Thomas Becket and his life and career before 1163. He was probably born on the 21st of December 1120 in London to a modest family of Norman origin. He was educated at Merton in Surrey by Augustinian canons, and then believed to have been educated at a grammar school in London, possibly at St Paul's Cathedral. In around 1138, he is believed to have been a student at Paris. In around 1143, he was appointed to the household of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, as a clerk, and it is during this time he is said to have studied law at Bologna and Auxerre for around a year. It is very hard to date precisely when this year was, and it is believed to be between 1148 and 1153. It is whilst in the household of Archbishop Theobald that he received numerous important ecclesiastical appointments. The most important of these was when he became Archdeacon of Canterbury after October 1154. An archdeacon was essentially the administrative deputy of a bishop in the rest of his diocese. In January 1155, Thomas Becket was appointed as Royal Chancellor by Henry II on the recommendation of Archbishop Theobald. And it is this appointment, in the words of the late historian Charles Duggan, that launched Becket on a career of affluence, brilliance and influence second to none in the kingdom. Henry and Becket enjoyed a highly positive and effective working relationship at this stage. Henry liked Becket immensely because of his own ecclesiastical interest and nature. Becket was not yet a full priest and would only be made a priest the night before his archiepiscopal consecration. He was still only a deacon, yet he was marked by an interest in more secular pursuits, such as the finer things in life, such as luxurious clothes and food, and also hunting and hawking. Very strange for a deacon at this time. It is highly likely that Henry II wanted this relationship to continue when he nominated Becket to succeed Theobald as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. It is believed that Henry wanted Becket to be his equivalent of Archbishop Lanfranc, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury during the reign of his great-grandfather, William I, where a positive and happy cooperative nature existed between church and state. There was also other contemporary examples during the reign of Henry II of a happy cooperation between church and state in Germany. The problems with this vision, and in particularly of a happy cooperation in the personification of Becket, occupying both Archbishop and Royal Chancellor, was Becket's dramatic change of attitude after his ordination as a priest on the 2nd of June 1162 and his archiepiscopal consecration on the 3rd of June 1162. The biographers of Thomas Becket's life note that after some deep reflection, he had a profound and significant transformation where he became a more pious man and more serious about religious matters. Historians have disagreed over the motivation and genuinity of this, and we will never know if Becket was genuine or not, but it is clear that he changed profoundly after his consecration. Physically, for example, he adopted the monastic habit, mirroring his predecessors as Archbishop of Canterbury, who had all been monks. Becket was the first man after the Norman conquest to become Archbishop who had not previously been a monk. And it is at this time that he may have adopted a hair shirt, which was an act of religious devotion by wearing an uncomfortable garment underneath your main clothes. He also resigned the chancellorship almost immediately. And this is where the root of the tension between Henry II and Becket is believed to have begun. From the point of Becket's almost immediate resignation of the chancellorship, that, according to Charles Duggan, Becket started to stand out as the champion of ecclesiastical rights and jurisdiction against the threat of secular encroachment. For example, he defended the right of the church to try its own in their own courts, and he also excluded a secular lord without royal permission, which was contrary to some so-called ancient customs, which I will move on to in a minute. By the autumn of 1163, Henry had three main grievances against Becket and some of his other bishops. He was annoyed at the church's protection of criminal clergy from what he saw as proper punishment for crime, the inordinate and irregular persecution of the laity for moral offences, and the disregard for ancient customs of the kingdom. He was so annoyed that he held a church council at Westminster in October 1163. It is at this council that Henry wanted the bishops to agree to hand criminous clerks or criminous clergy over to the secular court for into the secular jurisdiction. Henry Becket vigorously disagreed with this. Changing tact, Henry moved on to wanting the bishops to agree to observe the ancestral customs of the kingdom. Becket and his bishops agreed that they would observe these customs, saving their order, meaning that they would ignore customs that were contrary to canon law, the law that governed the church. It is after the breakup of this council, which only lasted for a day, that we come to the first occasion that Thomas Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury, was associated with Northampton. Becket met Henry II shortly after the Council of Westminster outside Northampton in a field which some people believe is where Becket's park is today, to discuss this conditional acceptance of the ancient customs. Nothing was agreed, and they moved on pretty quickly. But at this point, there was crucially a break in the relationship, but it is not absolute. And this came later at the Council of Clarendon in 1163, and in its aftermath at Northampton in the same year. At Clarendon, Henry demanded that the bishops should assent expressly, absolutely, and unconditionally to the customs and privileges of Henry I, his grandfather. Becket said that he would observe these customs in good faith, in bona fide. Crucially, these customs were unwritten, so it was felt that they could ignore the ones that they didn't like or were contrary to canon law. Immediately after this form of assent, Henry II ordered that these ancient customs were written down to prevent further confusion, and this was a novelty at the time. Becket stated that he was not old enough to know what was an ancient custom or not, and that he needed more time to seek legal advice and to clarify his thinking before he assented. But crucially, Becket left the council at Clarendon with a copy of the 16 customs, which we now know as the Constitutions of Clarendon. These constitutions are believed to have governed the relationship between church and state, and he left the council with a copy of these, which Henry II saw as formal acceptance of these constitutions. As a result of the growing tension between the two, Thomas Becket attempted to leave England twice after Clarendon, which was a violation of one of these 16 customs, which was the need for any clergyman who wished to leave the kingdom to seek royal permission to do so. Henry could have charged Becket on this, but he decided to use a feudal land case and financial suits to bend the Archbishop to his will. Henry II selected a case from John Fitzgilbert, the Marshal of the Exchequer and an important member of the King's government. John had brought a land suit into the Archbishop's honourial court, his secular court, for the possession of the manor of Pagham in Sussex. He didn't get a judgment in his favour, so he appealed to the King. It is as a result of this appeal that Becket was summoned to appear before the King on the 14th of September 1164. Becket did not appear. It is this failure to appear and to answer the official summons that allowed Henry to summon Becket to appear before him on secular grounds as a secular lord to answer the charge of contempt of the crown. And this is the occasion that we move on to the Council of Northampton in October 1164. As I previously mentioned, it is without exception of his murder the best attested episode in Thomas's life. Thomas is framed by his biographers in the image of Christ and his trial before Pontius Pilate, and the most reliable accounts that we have come from the lives of William Fitzstephen and Herbert of Bosham, who were two of Becket's clerks and were present at the council. The council was designed as a trial to humiliate Becket. For example, Becket was summoned to Northampton indirectly by the Sheriff of Kent, which in and of itself was a humiliating action. He normally would have been formally summoned by a writ, a formal document with the King's greetings, which he had been summoned on the 14th of September. This indirect summons was, according to Anne Duggan, a clear statement to all that Becket was a persona non grata. Becket arrived in Northampton on Tuesday the 6th of October 1164. He found that his normal lodgings at the castle were occupied by the royal entourage, so he found alternative place to stay at the Cluniac Priory of St Andrews in Northampton, which is believed to be around where the Mounts is today. Nothing happened for the rest of the day, as Henry II was out hawking along the Nen with other lords, and would not return until much later. On Wednesday the 7th of October, Becket returned to the castle and was denied the kiss of peace from Henry II, which, along with the formal summons, was a core part of elite social protocol. This refusal again emphasised Becket's status as a persona non grata. He was out of royal favour and out of the King's peace. Henry II told Becket, when he brought up the case of John Fitzgilbert, that John was currently in London and that he would have to return tomorrow. Becket was then ordered to return to his lodgings at St Andrews, and he did thusly. On Thursday the 8th of October, the first full day of business, in front of all the bishops, earls and barons of England and many of Normandy, a significant gathering of the great and good of the realm, Becket was formally accused of contempt of the king. Becket defended himself by arguing that John Fitzgilbert had made a false plea and was supported by perjury, that the case had rightfully belonged to the jurisdiction of the Archbishop, and that the court had given a just judgment, and therefore that was why he did not answer the King's appeal. William Fitzherbert notes that everyone, bishops and barons gathered, believed that there was no valid defence on the charge of contempt because of the respect that was due to royal authority, Becket's own liege homage, and oath to maintain the King's earthly honour, to the extent that Becket was condemned to forfeit all his movable goods at the King's mercy, and these were valued at around £500. Historians on the whole have accepted this verdict as valid and have criticised Becket for failing to answer the initial writ to meet the King on the 14th of September 1164. There was an argument in the court over who should deliver the sentence. Should it be a bishop or should it be a baron? And this is an indication of the confusion in which capacity Becket was being tried. Was he being tried as a bishop or was he being tried as a secular lord? Frustrated with this argument, Henry II ordered that the elderly Bishop of Winchester, Henry of Blois, to pass sentence, which he did with great reluctance. Becket accepted the judgment, and all the bishops of England, except Gilbert Folliot, the Bishop of London, and his arch-rival, agreed to be guarantors of Becket's fine. This is technically where the council should have concluded. The issue of contempt, for which Becket had been summoned for, had been finished and had ended, but Henry II attempted to return to Fitzgilbert's case and Fitzgilbert appeal, but no progress was made and it was subsequently dropped. It was likely to be dropped because the barons were on Becket's side in this particular instance. They did not want a precedent to be set where a judgment of a baronial court could be challenged in an appeal to the king. After this failure, Henry II moved on to other charges, which the historian David Knowles has labelled as frankly punitive. These were measures designed to break the Archbishop's will. The charges implied that Becket had embezzled the money of the castles of Eye and Berkhamsted to the value of £300. These castles had been in his custody while he was Royal Chancellor. Without accepting the charge and refusing to enter litigation, Becket agreed to repay the money in order to appease and mollify the king, and thus concluded that day. On Friday, the 9th of October, Becket was again sued for a loan of around 500 marks incurred in the expedition to Toulouse in 1159, a military campaign undertaken by Henry II whilst Becket was Royal Chancellor to regain the ancestral lands of Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And he was sued for another 500 marks borrowed on the king's guarantee. Becket was also cited to provide the receipts of revenue of vacant bishoprics and abbacies that had occurred during his chancellorship. When a bishopric became vacant, the revenues of the diocese passed into the king's coffers, again being a significant source of revenue for the king. So this is a serious and a large amount of money. Becket replied that he had neither prepared for this suit or been summoned for it, and this will be frequently repeated by Becket over the course of the coming days. He said he would answer this case, if necessary, when called and formally summoned at the right time and at the right place. Becket withdrew to the Priory of Northampton, Priory of St Andrews in Northampton, for the consultation with his suffragan bishops and clerks. On the fourth day, Saturday the 10th of October, 856 years ago today, discussion and council ensued at St Andrew's Priory. We have no evidence of what the abbots present gave as their advice, but we have the bishop's responses, and they are well recorded within The Life of Thomas Becket by Allen of Tewkesbury, whose main source was Master Lombard of Piazzina, who was Becket's main legal advisor and was definitely present at the Council of Northampton. The most senior bishop, Henry of Winchester, offered to pay the king 2,000 marks to settle the charges, and this was broadly supported by the bishops present. When presented to Henry II, he flatly refused, for it was not about the money, it was about ensuring the church succumbed to his will. Gilbert Folliot argued that Becket should resign and should throw himself at the king's mercy, and this was supported by another one of Becket's rivals, Hilary of Chichester, who bluntly told Becket to resign, saying that he wished for Thomas Becket to return to being ordinary Thomas. The view given by Bartholomew of Exeter, which is a more reluctant agreement with these more extreme views of Gilbert Folliot and Hilary of Chichester, probably marks the views and the positions occupied by the majority of bishops. Bartholomew had received his bishopric through the influence of Becket, but argued that the times were evil and maybe it was better for the sacrifice of one archbishop and that he should resign in order to save the whole church from slavery. This position was vigorously denied and unsupported by Henry of Winchester, who argued that ensuring the royal authorities making an archbishop resign set a dangerous precedent. It was telling that he was able to give this view, as he was of royal blood, who was the brother of the previous king and Henry II's cousin. But the advice that comes from Bartholomew of Exeter is clear that Henry II's anger is considerable and that these bishops are genuinely scared. Not much happened on Sunday the 11th of October or Monday the 12th of October. At the end of the day, on the 11th on the Sunday, Becket succumbed to a mysterious illness, possibly renal colic, but also possibly the culmination of the psychological and emotional pressure that he had been put under. The 12th of October, the Monday, nothing happened because he was too ill to attend court, and Henry II sent 2 leading barons to investigate to see if he was telling the truth. It is on Monday that rumours started to spread across Northampton that the king wanted to kill or imprison Becket. And now we come to the most dramatic and final day of the Council of Northampton, Tuesday the 13th of October. Anne Duggan has noted that Becket seems to have spent the night behind the altar in the Church of St Andrews, another indication of the genuine fear that Henry II could inspire in people. The bishops came on that morning to beg Becket to resign and to submit to the king's will. They had heard that Henry had wanted to try Becket as a traitor, which, if found guilty, would probably have led to his execution. Becket bluntly refused and found, like on his episcopal consecration, a new inner strength. He had said that twice the bishops had sided with them, and he admonished them for this and forbade them to sit and convict him with the secular authorities again. He also stated that he would appeal to Rome, the refuge of all the oppressed, for justice, and said he would excommunicate anyone who laid violent hands on him and forced him to accept the court's judgment. Gilbert Folliot counter-appealed to the Pope, and it is likely he had been preparing for this, for he would have had to have gained royal support for his appeal, as Clause 8 of the Constitutions of Clarendon forbade appeal to the Pope without royal permission. Becket later said Mass on that day, but it was not the customary Mass of the day, but he said the Mass of St Stephen being the first Christian martyr, and this has traditionally been seen by historians as a provocative act. The introit, which is a passage sung or stated whilst a priest is ascending to the altar to consecrate the Eucharist, was that princes also did sit and speak against me, very pertinent for Becket's case at this trial. However, more recently, Anne Duggan has seen this as an act of complete and utter desperation. He had no other options except to fall back on his authority in the church. After having said Mass, he went to the castle, supposedly with a consecrated host on his person, in case he needed it for his own last rites. It is when he reached the castle that he insisted on carrying his archiepiscopal cross. As Archbishop and Metropolitan, which is the ultimate authority in a particular ecclesiastical province, he was entitled to have the cross carried in front of him to signify the Archbishop's arrival. By carrying this cross into court, he was reminding them, and all present, that he was not just a secular lord or a royal vassal, but he was a fully consecrated archbishop that had his own rights and his own privileges. This was seen by Gilbert Folliot as an act of extreme aggression, but Becket retorted that it was a sign of peace. We don't know how the Northampton Castle was made up, but we do know that there was at least one building that had 2 floors. Becket sat downstairs and Henry II sat upstairs. It is upstairs that the bishops told Henry II of the planned appeal to Rome. Henry sent earls and barons to ask Thomas Becket if the appeal was true, and to remind him that he had sworn fealty to the king and to preserve the royal rights and privileges at Clarendon. He was also asked again to provide the accounts for his chancellorship and to accept the judgment of his court. Becket refused, again citing that he had not been summoned to answer these charges, and confirmed he was appealing to the Pope. Long negotiations ensued between the 2 parties, and the bishops were excused following Becket's earlier prohibition from sitting in judgment by the king, and were given the permission to appeal to the Pope, but they were only instructed to seek Becket's removal as Archbishop of Canterbury, which it seems to have been Gilbert Folliot's idea. This is unsurprising, as Gilbert Folliot is said to have been jealous of Becket and wanted the Archbishopric of Canterbury for himself. The barons, led by the Justiciar, who was the chief legal officer in England, the Earl of Leicester, went downstairs to Becket, and again Becket refused to accept their judgment, adding, in addition to that he'd not been summoned for these particular cases, that the barons were not qualified to try him as an archbishop. Becket left the court once the Justiciar had failed in his arguments and started to fluster, to the jeers of the rest of the court of perjurer and traitor. He subsequently returned to St Andrew's Priory and was followed by an admiring crowd of townspeople. When asking for permission to leave Northampton to return to Canterbury, Henry II refused to give an answer that evening and stated that he would give it on the morning of the 14th of October. Thomas Becket spent the night in Northampton to allay suspicions of escape and left an hour before dawn on the morning of the 14th through an unguarded door of the unguarded north gate of Northampton. When told that he had left, Henry responded, "Non dum finivinimus cum isto. We've not finished with this wretched fellow yet." But unfortunately, we have finished with this wretched fellow, for it is this early morning escape that ends Thomas Becket's direct association with Northampton. He never returned, and he subsequently went into exile in France, only to return in late 1170 after a fragile reconciliation between him and Henry II, and he returned around about December, shortly before his death. In this anniversary year, where focus will mostly be on his murder in the cathedral, it is important to reflect on the early part of Becket's career in order to understand the origins of Becket's violent demise. Thank you very much. Now, if anybody has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer it. I'm just going to log on now and see if there is anyone who wants to ask anything. I apologise for the delay. There is a little bit of a delay in the feed between me recording it, so I won't get questions for a little while. But if I do, I'll be more than happy to ask, so please ask away, ask anything, even if it's just generally about Becket's life, if it's about the historical reputation or the historical accuracy of certain plays or films, whatever, please ask away. I have one question about, is the divine right of kings by this point? I'm not entirely sure there is. I believe that there is a definite idea that kings are anointed by God and that they protect the church. But in papal circles, there is seen to be a theory of two swords, in which there are two sides to one sword, the church and the and secular authorities, and it is both their responsibility to protect church's interests. There's probably not a defined theory of the divine right of kings at this point, but it is safe to say that they did believe that they had authority from God. So thank you very much for that question. I have another about, is the rivalry between Becket and the king only sacred versus secular issue, or competition of who had ultimate divine authority? That's a very interesting question, thank you. As I said, it's multifaceted. So I think there are people who are more extreme on the side of it being who has ultimate divine authority. On Henry II's point of view, he came to the throne after a very tumultuous period known in historiography as the Anarchy of Civil War, and he was very keen to reinstitute law and order. He saw, as part of this institution of law and order, that the church was almost allowing its priests to get away with crime that would lead to mutilation or execution in a secular court. This is something he didn't like, and it's not strictly true, but it's how he perceived it. So that's another issue, is about who has ultimate legal jurisdiction, not just about secular authority. But again, in the context of this time, it is about who has authority over the church and who does have direct divine authority. But again, it's very complex. We can also probably see this rivalry as quite personal, a sort of personal betrayal of friendship or of patronage, which Henry definitely feels that Becket is being ungrateful for everything he has done, whilst Becket is definitely thinking that he is protecting the rights of the church, the divine rights of the church, and the ones that have been given to it by God, against secular authorities, which is also empowered by God, but has no right over the church. For this time, it's a very hierarchical society, and although church and king are about equal, there is definitely a tussle between who has ultimate control over the spiritual authority. I think that is it for questions. I'll sit here for 1 minute more if anything else comes through. I don't seem to have any more questions, so that just leaves me to thank you for coming today, and thank you very much for taking part. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed